Hi everyone, welcome to Philosopher Meets Critics. In this series, we engage directly with authors about their newly released philosophical works. The series is jointly hosted and organized by the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil and Concept, the Cologne Center for Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian Tradition here at the University of Cologne. I am Luis Rosa, assistant professor here at Concept, and I will be your host and chair for this session. So I'm excited to introduce today's author, Thomas Kelly, or Tom, professor of philosophy at Princeton University. His book is titled Bias, a Philosophical Study. It was published last year by Oxford University Press, and it explores a number of fundamental questions about the nature of bias and prejudice and our practices of attributing it. As commentators, or the critics, we have Sinan Dogramaci, professor of philosophy at University of Texas at Austin, Sophie Horowitz, professor of philosophy at University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and Brian Hedden, professor of philosophy at Australian National University. In terms of format, we'll start with a 15-minute summary by Tom, followed by each of the critics. Each of them will also have 15 minutes to issue their comments, and after each critic, Tom will have about 10 minutes to respond, and we postpone any further discussion or replies to the end so that each critic has the same amount of time at their disposal. So that's how it roughly goes. And without further ado, we start then with Thomas Kelly on his book, Bias, a Philosophical Study.
Thank you very much, Luis. And I do want to thank all the folks at Cologne for supporting this and doing this. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book. I'm a big fan of the series. I love the fact that you guys are doing this and the way you're doing it. As I think you know, I've already participated in it as a critic. So that was a lot of fun. So it's really fun to flip things around and get to experience things from the author's perspective. I also want to thank my critics, or commentators, which I prefer. Commentators seems less harsh than critics. Sinan, Sophie, and Brian. Genuinely honored to have you guys, philosophers as capable of you guys and as distinguished as you are, being my critics. I realize this is all time taken away, and time and intellectual energy taken away from your own research, so I appreciate that. I forgive you guys in advance. I know you're going to ask me some tough questions. You don't have to do that. Forgive me for not asking me softball questions that I could have hit for easy home runs or something like that. Okay, so at this point, I'll jump right in. As Louis said, the title of the book is Bias, a Philosophical Study, and it's really about two big topics. First, there's bias itself, the phenomenon in the world, and the second big topic is our practices of attributing bias, whether to other people or to ourselves or to sources of information or to whatever. And both of those topics, both the phenomenon and our practice of attributing bias, will be center stage today. So start with the first topic. How am I thinking about the phenomenon itself, bias? In the book, I explore a certain framework for thinking about bias that I call the norm theoretic account. And so first, here's the basic idea in kind of unqualified slogan form. A bias involves a systematic departure from a norm. And here's an analogy I like to use. I find it kind of helpful trying to warm people up, at least the way I'm thinking about bias. It involves an archer shooting arrows. When I was working on this material, I was team teaching a seminar with Ernest Sosa at Rutgers. It was a joint Princeton-Rutgers seminar. And Ernie's really big on these archery examples. So I kind of was influenced by this. So here's my example. Suppose we've got three archers and they're shooting at a target in the distance. And one of the three archers is very skilled and she typically hits the target. And the other two archers are unskilled and they typically miss, but there's a crucial difference between them. The second archer misses, but his misses are all over the place. He's just as likely to miss high as low and miss to the left as to the right. So there's no predictable pattern. Okay. Third archer typically misses, but they tend to miss low and to the left. So there's this predictable pattern. And it's also true, even when they're not shooting, it's still true that this third archer is disposed to miss low and to the left. So suggestion, let's try to think about the biased person. Maybe the biased person is like the third archer, who's disposed to miss the target in a certain direction, as opposed to the first archer who reliably hits it, or the second archer who misses, but misses all over the place. And if we try to understand bias in terms of that analogy, the following question comes up right away. For the archers, there's this clear success condition. Success consists in hitting the target. And so what's analogous to hitting the target when we're talking about bias? And on my view, that's shifty. It jumps around from context to context. That question corresponds to which norm are we talking about when we talk about bias. And in different contexts, there'll be a different norm. In lots of cases, I think the relevant norm is truth or accuracy. So, even before we get to human believer, statisticians will divide error into two types, systematic error and random error, where intuitively random error is kind of missing all over the map, and systematic error is missing in some direction. And even before we start thinking about human beings or human believers, we can think about weather forecasting methods, right? And maybe there's one weather forecasting method that the estimates that returns of the daily high temperatures are sometimes too high and sometimes too low. That method might be unbiased, even though it's unreliable, as opposed to another method where it's consistently too high. That method is going to be unreliable and biased, right? Counts as a biased model. And in many contexts, I think when we're talking about bias, especially when we're talking about human believers, the relevant norm is truth or accuracy, but not always. Sometimes the norm is something else. For example, it might be a norm, a practical norm. Suppose the norm that governs rational action is maximize expected utility. Then we can understand all of these practical biases with reference to that norm. So we understand the agent who's in the grips of so-called status quo bias. What is it to be in the grips of status quo bias? That's to be disposed to depart from the true rational norm, maximize expected utility in a certain way. Namely, you favor options that tend to preserve the status quo over options that would actually maximize expected utility, right? So it might be a practical norm of practical rationality. It might be an epistemic norm, probabilistic coherence, or some kind of evidentialist norm. If it's a norm, proportion your beliefs to the evidence. And every week I'm too confident relative to the evidence that my favorite football team is going to win its game, then will count me as a biased believer for that reason. In some cases, it might be a moral norm, right? So suppose it's a genuine norm, treat people with the respect to which they're entitled. And you can imagine different ways of deviating from that norm. Maybe somebody keeps deviating from that norm, but is kind of an equal opportunity offender. They treat everybody badly, right, without the respect to which they're entitled. That person is an unbiased jerk, right? I'm not saying he's biased, but if somebody is more likely to depart from that norm when they're dealing with women as opposed to men, or blacks as opposed to whites, or the old as opposed to the young, then that person will count as biased, right? Okay. So that's just, in a nutshell, kind of the general norm theoretic idea. Let me turn next to the second big theme, which is our practices of attributing bias. And there, my big idea is what I call the perspectival character of bias attributions. So idea, generally speaking, who or what we take to be biased, who we take to be biased about a particular topic isn't independent of our first order view about that topic, right? So for example, let's suppose the topic is politics, but it'll work for anything. I think it'll work for weather forecasting as well as politics. And suppose, presumably, you've got a bunch of political opinions, which policies would be good policies, which policies are bad policies, about individuals, politicians, which politicians are good leaders, and which would lead us off the cliff if they got back in office or something like that. So think of those as your first order political opinions, right? In addition to those first order political opinions, you've probably got some beliefs about who's biased about politics or what's biased, right? Maybe you think Fox News has a conservative bias, or MSNBC has a progressive bias, or certain individuals, so maybe certain members of your extended family you think have certain political biases and so on, right? So on one hand, you've got the first order political opinions. On the other hand, you've got these opinions about bias about politics. And then the perspectival character of bias attributions just says, look, those kinds of opinions, those two levels aren't independent of one another. Either psychologically or rationally. So as I understand it, this perspectival character has both a psychological aspect. So at the level of psychology, our first order views about politics will both influence and be influenced by our higher order views about, say, which sources of information about politics are biased and unbiased. So that's just the level of psychology. And relatedly, at the level of rationality too, there's, our first order views about politics will be both influenced by and influence and be rationally constrained by our higher order views about bias in politics, right? So I try to spell that out in some detail, although no doubt much more could have been done. And I argue that in addition to being kind of a plausible picture in its own right, it also has various fruitful applications. And one of the applications that I'm kind of most excited about, in fact, to be honest, I'm a little bit proud of this application, is when I apply this framework to what psychologists call the bias blind spot. And so let me say a bit about that, because I think this is going to be raised by multiple commentators or critics. So what's the bias blind spot? That's the fact that we tend to see ourselves as more objective and less biased than our peers. And that phenomenon's been, you might have been that's what we'd expected anyway, but it's been, in any case, extensively documented by psychologists. So it's definitely a real thing. And then there's this question, what explains that? What psychological mechanisms produce the bias blind spot? And I develop a novel explanation of the bias blind spot in terms of the perspectival account of bias attributions and the norm theoretic account of bias. And I say, look, if you spot me those two things, I'll show you exactly why you get this effect across a range of cases. And I argue in the book that my proposal is actually an improvement. It, in certain quite specific respects, it improves upon the kinds of hypotheses, theoretical hypotheses, that are on offer by the social psychologists who've actually studied the phenomenon empirically and documented it. Okay. So I said, I'm proud of that. That's only so far. As I also said, I think commentators are going to take issue with it. So maybe by the end of the session, I won't be proud. Maybe I'll even be ashamed and wish I could take it back or something. But anyway, we'll see. There's all kinds of things, topics of the book I won't be able to summarize or even gesture at. So let me just mention two others, because these things will be at issue with the commentators. Another big theme in the book is symmetry. So I argue there are important connections between bias attributions, and symmetry. So think of a very simple paradigm of a biased object, the biased coin, right? So what is it for a coin to be biased? So when any coin's flipped, there are two possible outcomes, and it's characteristic of the unbiased coin that there's a symmetry between the two outcomes, heads or tails, in as much as they're equally probable, right? In the case of the biased coin, that symmetry is absent. And the same thing holds if we're thinking about subjective probability as opposed to physical or objective probability. So imagine a person who is, we know it's a fair coin and so on, but is disposed, finds himself disposed or inclined to give more credence to it's going to land heads than it's going to land tails when it's flipped. That person has kind of a pro-heads bias, right? And it's natural to think that that description as biased involves violating a symmetry constraint on rational believing. And in the book, I suggest that story generalizes even in more complicated cases, even when we're not talking about probability, paradigmatic instances of bias, or at least many paradigmatic instances of bias, involve departures from standards that we naturally conceptualize as symmetry standards, while being unbiased involves respecting or preserving certain symmetries and invariances. And when it comes to bias attributions, I argue that our willingness to attribute bias is very sensitive to these kinds of symmetry considerations, and to the extent to which we're conceptualizing something as a departure from symmetry, or not conceptualizing it that way. Okay, and I apply that idea in a number of different places, and one of the main applications brings me to the last topic on the handout, and this is the contrast between what I call pejorative attributions of bias and non-pejorative attributions of bias. And so start with pejorative uses of bias. So suppose somebody says, the judge is biased, right? Or your friend's political beliefs are biased, right? No one's going to hear that as a neutral description of the judge or your friend's political beliefs. we naturally hear it automatically and naturally hear it as a criticism, right? So that's what I call the pejorative use of bias. And pejorative uses are extremely common, both in everyday life and also in the sciences and in the academy. On the other hand, it's also true that many uses of bias, again, in everyday life and in the academy or the sciences, we often attribute bias where no negative evaluation or criticism is intended, and that's clear. So here's an example of this. It's kind of particularly salient for us as epistemologists. Imagine a Bayesian, whether some philosopher or some cognitive scientist or whatever, some Bayesian who starts talking about our inductive biases. And they might say things like this: look, our inductive biases are what make learning from experience possible, right? Where it's clear there's no negative judgment intended. There's no suggestion we'd be better off if we didn't have these inductive biases. On the contrary, we wouldn't be able to learn from experience at all, right? And now the norm theoretic account is an account of bias in the pejorative sense, right? And in my view, the fact that it's a bad thing, there's something negative about being biased, at least prima facie, goes with the fact that you're systematically departing from a genuine norm or disposed to do that, right? So the norm theoretic account is supposed to capture the pejorative use of bias, but I also wanted to give some account of the non-pejorative sense or the non-pejorative uses, especially because it's not as though, I take it pretty clear, it's not as though the word bias is itself ambiguous across these pejorative uses and these non-pejorative uses, right? So it's not like, you've got this English word bank that's ambiguous, and we used to talk about financial institutions and riverbanks. It's an accident we're using the same word. I don't think it's an accident we're using the same word bias to describe the biased judge who's comes into the trial disposed to find the guy guilty even before the evidence is presented, that we're using the word bias to refer to that guy who we're judging negatively. And we're using it in the case of inductive biases, where certain hypotheses maybe start off ahead of other hypotheses before the evidence comes in. Okay. So I'm thinking a sufficiently comprehensive account of bias and bias attributions should have something to say about this. And this is one of the places where the theme of symmetry plays a big role. And I'm almost out of time, so just let me baldly state the idea here. Observation, here's an important fact about our practices of attributing bias. We're often willing to attribute bias to a believer or an agent when they systematically depart or systematically dispose to depart from some contextually salient symmetry standard, even if we don't endorse the idea that that symmetry standard is a genuine norm, right? So for example, in the inductive biases case, and imagine this Bayesian isn't thinking there's some true indifference principle or something like that. Nevertheless, there's still this kind of obvious symmetry standard that's very salient. Well, what about this possibility is giving equal credence or equal prior probability to every hypothesis, right? And if the believer is giving more credence to some rather than others, because they're departing from the salient symmetry standard, we naturally describe that as a kind of bias, an inductive bias, even if we don't endorse it as a norm that you ought to be splitting your credences evenly among the possible hypotheses or something like that, right? So that's the attempt to capture the non-pejorative or neutral use of bias. And then we can understand bias in the pejorative sense as something like a special case of that general phenomenon, the special case in which, to first approximation, the salient symmetry standard that the agent's is departing from is in fact a genuine norm. Okay, let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, so now we move on to Sinan Dogramaci's comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Luis, and everyone at Concept and Brazil for inviting me and everyone to this event. And thanks to Tom for his important role in it and the production of a wonderful book. I've been enjoying this book for some time now because the year before last, I taught a graduate seminar, and a number of weeks of the seminar were taken up studying the book with my co-instructor, Roy Sorensen, and our students. And it was just really enjoyable to read, think about, and talk about. I believe viewers of this video will have access to my handout. I'm going to make my presentation stay close to the handout because I think it'll be hard to follow both my speaking in the handout if I don't keep them close. Bias is a superb book. The topics it examines couldn't be more interesting and important. The treatment is deep and remarkably clear at the same time. Highly general theses are convincingly defended and also shown to have exciting concrete applications, as we just observed. And I honestly just really enjoyed thinking about it and reading it. I'm going to ask 5 questions, as you can see if you look at my handout. I don't believe we'll have time to give attention to all of them. I may not even be able to read them all, but the first 3 are the most important in any case, and Tom and I talked ahead of time that we'll both plan to focus on the first questions. The first question, also, I should give full credit to one of the students from my graduate seminar, Ron Avney. It's his question entirely, and I thought it was so helpful that I wanted to bring it up here. The first question is about this notion of systematic rather than random deviation from a norm. As we heard, Tom says bias requires systematic rather than random deviation. And this is something he says in particular about the pejorative attributions of bias. And the question is, does this idea of systematic deviation require that the deviations, and thus the biases, are relative to certain metrics rather than others? Let me elaborate a little on what I mean. In order to distinguish a random from a systematic deviation from a norm, we must rely on some underlying background metric that will classify any error as either, as Tom frequently puts it, an overshooting or an undershooting. Or in more complex cases, there may be more dimensions to it, too far to the left or the right, or too high or too low. 2 dimensions in that example, 3 or more in others. In all of Tom's example, the background metric, what's an overshooting, what's an undershooting, what's too high, what's too much to the left, the background metric is so simple, natural, and intuitive. For example, too conservative versus too progressive, too favorable versus too unfavorable to your own kid or your team, that we don't even notice we're using it. But as philosophers, we know in any example, some gruesome or questrous metric could also be used so as to reinterpret random noise into a set of systematic deviations, or vice versa. So this is a new way, perhaps, that naturalness is being relied on philosophically, distinct from its familiar role in standards of rationality or all the other examples you'll see in, for example, Ted Sider's influential book of the world. Let me give a specific illustration of what I mean by a gruesome metric. When we classify my dart throws, or the archer's shots, at the bullseye or the target as biased, that will depend on whether we use the natural metric of too high, too low, too far left, too far right, or else use some distorted, gruesome metric. You can imagine, for example, one that measures distance from the bullseye as distance along a route that spirals out increasingly far from the bullseye. That will give you different results about whether your shot was far or close to the bullseye than the intuitive natural one we use. Actually, I asked Ron Avney if I could relay his question in this meeting, and he said yes, and he even reminded me we can use familiar illustrations from Bertrand's paradox, including Van Frossen's famous illustration, to make the point as well. Imagine I'm trying to estimate the sizes of boxes, and they range from 1 foot high to 3 feet high, and I'm trying to be unbiased in my estimates of the sizes, and so I focus on the length, and I estimate them closer to the 3 range and past the halfway mark of 2, just as often as I estimate them closer to the short side, the 1 range, and so under the halfway mark of 2. To do that and be unbiased with respect to length will force me to be biased towards the high end of their volumes, which ranges all the way up to 27. And so it seems like we have to say something about whether we mean estimates of size are systematic deviations with respect to length or area or volume or what have you, since it will make a difference to conclusions about whether or not I'm biased. I think similar questions arise here about the role of naturalness in symmetry violations involved in non-pejorative attributions of bias, but I didn't want to focus this question on that because I suspect Tom was always sensitive to and open to the idea that those symmetry standards rely on the notion of naturalness. But this present question targets a perhaps more surprising respect in which there's some heavy-duty lifting coming from the notion of naturalness in the pejorative attributions of bias, all due to the reliance on the systematic versus random distinction. Okay, that's the first question. The second question, and the third as well, will be about the bias blind spot. Here's the second question. Tom proposes a novel explanation for why we have a bias blind spot. A stronger explanation, I agree, than what psychologists have offered. And I do think this is one of the most fascinating contributions of the book, really impressive. Tom's explanation centrally appeals to the fact that when we assess who is or isn't biased, we must do so from our own perspective. If you want to compare someone's beliefs against the truth, the only means you have for that is to compare their beliefs against your own beliefs. Of course, pointlessly testing yourself for bias by comparing your own beliefs against your own beliefs never returns a positive result for bias. This perspectival explanation most directly applies to truth biases. We quickly see others as biased against the truth, but we don't so quickly see ourselves as so biased. Tom briefly suggests how this perspectival explanation also applies to blindness with other biases too, such as the status quo bias. Here's what worries me now. I suspect humans tend to think they're less biased than other people across pretty much the full range of biases. For example, I suspect we each think we're less ideological, less selfish, have fewer immoral biases against poor and vulnerable groups, and so on. And here we might consider the list of self-serving attributional biases Tom talks about on page 155 of the book. For example, when I think about people who are richer than me, I find it very easy to recognize their selfishness, their inexcusable neglect of the poor and the vulnerable. But I don't incline toward reflecting on whether I should, say, sell my piano and thereby save some number of lives that I'd hate to even know how many would it be. When forced to even consider it, I'm immediately tempted to dig up reasons why my own standard of luxurious living is permissible, surely giving a biased defense if I'm forced to continue to reflect and to admit it. This brings me to the question, can the perspectival explanation apply to all cases where we are quicker to see bias in others than in ourselves? Why do I easily see that your privileged lifestyle is biased against the poor in favor of your rich self, but I can hardly be made to pause to notice mine is too? I can't clearly see how the perspectival explanation could even apply. I worry we'll need some distinct kind of psychological explanation for our blindness here, but it's natural to think that there is one general explanation for why we have a distortedly favorable view of ourselves across the board, including regarding the truth bias and our own reliability. Okay, I hope I'll have time at least to address the third question, another one about the bias blind spot. It's brief. Here's the third issue. Tom claims people naturally produce false negatives about whether we are biased. In other words, we tend to think we're not biased even when we really are biased. But we don't have to make that mistake, and we should avoid making it. It would be obvious bootstrapping, as we saw in the case of truth bias. In these cases where we falsely conclude we're not biased, we could have and we should have said, we just don't know. whether we're biased. We could and should suspend judgment more often about ourselves. So what Tom can explain, I think, is why we can detect biases in others more readily than we can in ourselves, in particular, in the specific respect of truth deviation. I think we've seen that. Here's the third question. But how could Tom explain why humans draw the conclusion that other people are more biased than themselves? Here's an analogy to make my point. If, imagine for whatever reason, I can readily detect others' heights, but not my own, why should I or why would I conclude that others are taller than me? Well, given that we actually do make these unforced false negative assessments about our own lack of bias, what explains it? And I myself am I'm unsure how Tom's framework can give an explanation here. Now, I have two more questions about bias. They're both about bias and knowledge. Luis, am I out of time? I believe I may be close to it.
Yeah, but you have about 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. I'm going to trust that my handout would be comprehensible to anyone who's interested. So I will not try to compress into 2 minutes what the other questions are in full. I'll just say the second to last question is about how bias can block knowledge. And Tom proposes that it involves the bias being about deviation from an epistemic norm, and there's some concern about which norms we would understand as epistemic so that the proposal is illuminating. I think what he says is correct, but I worried about whether similar things could be said about how bias blocks rational belief as opposed to knowledge. There, I thought it'd be harder to give an illuminating explanation of the same kind. The fifth question is about some material at the very end of the book about whether our methods that we've evolved to use that have a bias built into them involve a non-accidental reliability that distinguishes us from the most blindly and out of nowhere biased thinkers who have no explanation of their bias, and whether or not this makes a difference to the possibility of combining bias with knowledge, which Tom says can only happen under special conditions. I'll leave things there. Let me use the sandwich method. I said the book was great at the beginning, and I want to say this book is really good. It should be read. I think it will be read by philosophers and non-philosophers. It has a reach. It's written in a way that is going to convey itself to and its points clearly to anyone. My only real complaint with the book is that when you read it carefully, it falls apart in a physical sense. My pages are being just barely kept in one room, but that's a reason to get 2 copies.
Thank you very much, Sinan. Okay, so let me speak to these. I'll go in order. First about unnatural, unintuitive, gruesome metrics. And so the thought that, look, you could use gruesome metrics to reclassify what we think of as systematic deviations could look like random noise, and what we think of as random noise could start looking systematic. And then you just straightforwardly applied my framework about bias, you'd end up flipping things around, what's bias and what isn't, and so on. So really fascinating. This isn't something that was on my radar screen at all until you called it to my attention. So thanks to you and your student, Ron, for coming up with this. So I think this much is right, that in making these judgments about bias, we are taking it for granted that certain metrics are kind of the ones to use and kind of ignoring these other ones we might be using. For what it's worth, the way I was thinking about it in the book, and there's lots of stuff in the book about metaphysics of bias, but this issue, I think I was thinking about bias in a pretty realist way, at least certain biases, right? So suppose there's some genuine moral norm, and then there's this guy, let's call him the sexist, and he much more often departs from that norm when he's interacting with women than men. The fact that that guy's biased in that way, I'm thinking that's a hard fact about the world. And it doesn't depend so much, the fact that this guy's biased, on our practices or our schemes of classification, or which metrics we're using. I think when we say the guy's biased, we're not only saying something true, but it's kind of a joint carving fact that we're stating, right? And so in that sense, I think, although it uses terminology in the book, I kind of favor a certain kind of metaphysical realism about certain kinds of bias. And if you're realist about bias, and you've got my general framework, then that goes with certain other things, including think of the norms as having a certain kind of objectivity, mind independence, and so on. And it's not just a matter of our practices and how we do things. And it also goes with, to go to the point about metrics, thinking that some metrics are metaphysically privileged over others. So that is a commitment of this kind of realist way I was thinking about it. That having been said, there's no argument for that kind of realist picture in the book. So, for all, I appreciate you're saying it's virtues, but don't go looking for that argument in there. And I think this is true, that as far as I can see, it's consistent with my general framework that you could go non-realist about bias all the way down, right, for every bias, and say, no, there aren't any deep facts about something's being biased, independently of our practices of clarification or which metrics we're using and so on, right? So you're alluding to Nelson Goodman and Guru, and I think also in your comments you alluded to Wittgenstein and rule following. And so you can have a view about bias, I think, consistent with my general framework that's analogous to the view those guys ended up taking, right? So Goodman, the original Goodman paper, a lot of people end up saying these very metaphysical realist things, well, there is this deep metaphysical difference between green and blue on the one hand and Guru and blue on the other. Goodman himself famously or notoriously didn't do that. So in the later work, when he tries to solve the problem, it all depends on our past practices. So the reason green and blue are projectable and the reason green and blue are projectable and Guru and blue aren't is we've projected green and blue in the past. And maybe if our past practice, the clear suggestion is if our past practice had been different, then it would be different now, right? And I think consistent with my framework, there's a view about bias that's analogous to that one. There aren't any deep facts about bias independent of our practices of attributing bias, and our practices use certain metrics as opposed to others, but we could be using different metrics or something like that, in which case the facts about bias would shift around, right? Okay, so I don't find that particularly attractive, at least for all biases, but I don't argue against it. And as far as I can see, it's consistent with much of the general framework. Okay, so really interesting stuff. Let me turn next to the questions about the bias blind spot. So there's two questions here, one of which is, does my account give us enough generality? Can it cover all the cases where we want it to cover? And Sinan suggests he finds this plausible that pretty much will end up, we should think that it might be human beings pretty much tend to have the blind spot with respect to the full range of human biases or something close to that. To what extent could my account cover that? And you can imagine getting evidence this is true. Suppose it turns out the way Sinan thinks it will. Could this explanation be extended to cover all of those kind of putative facts? Maybe not. At least I don't see how to do it. So it might need to be supplemented in certain ways. If I emphasize we're not in this situation, but suppose you really did get evidence that yeah, this is true across the board, and somebody else came up with some general explanation that could really give a satisfying explanation in all these cases, I think I would just concede defeat and say, yes, go with her theory. It's better than mine in that circumstance. As things actually stand, I think I'd retreat to the more modest claim that given the actual data we've got and the theories that are on the table, including mine, I think mine's preferable and in fact has a certain kind of generality. Let me speak to what I take the actual evidence to be, and so on. So first, I think the evidence doesn't suggest that we're equally susceptible to the bias blind spot across the board, right? So there's lots of biases that people are happy to admit to, right? So start with kind of an easy case. People won't fight you too much on are you biased in favor of, do you have any biases in favor of your own kids, right? Now, maybe there's this kind of obvious confounding factor, which is people don't even think it's bad to be biased in favor of their own kids. Maybe it's even good to be biased in favor of your own kids or something like that. But even biases that we admit are not so great, and we better off without them, people will admit to it. So, here's a bias a lot of people have. They tend to underestimate how long it will take them to complete their projects, right? So if somebody puts, do you think of that bias? I put my hand right away, right? And lots of people admit to this, right? And generally, so the data here is kind of interestingly nuanced. When you describe many of these biases in a very kind of abstract way, and say, here's what the bias is, here's the name of the bias, here's what it is, and you tell people, yeah, lots of people in the human population have this. Do you think you might have it too, to some extent? People won't fight you on that, right? And they're often also, interestingly, kind of relatively, or at least relatively open to thinking maybe their past self was biased in certain sorts of ways. Here's where they're really digging their heels, is when they're thinking about some issue or some set of issues, and they arrive at some belief about it. And then the suggestion by the psychologist is made to them, yeah, but you got this belief about this issue that you just told me about, but what if you might be biased about that issue, right? Do you think you might be biased about it? People will really dig in their heels, right? No, I'm not biased. Even when the psychologists start giving them evidence, right, about like, look, here's how you arrived at the belief, doesn't look kind of sketchy. Here are some things that are true of you that tends to correlate with being biased. People still are quite resistant to thinking, no, my current beliefs are biased and so on. They'll say, even if they agree, yeah, people in my circumstances tend to be biased, but I'm not right now. This is an exceptional case, right? And I think that fact, that's where you really get this, fits quite well with the way I'm thinking about it, precisely because, on my view, this is where you really expect it to show up. There's the really thing people are resistant to is your current beliefs or something like that are biased. Can you, will you get people to admit to that, right? So I don't want to claim too much here. If things went a certain way, then I would say, yeah, I can't cover all the cases. Maybe there's already cases that I can't cover that you suggested that we already know this. For what it's worth, the other views on offer already, it's not like they cover all the cases. They'll be bringing in things like, better than, people are motivated to believe the best about themselves to cover some of these cases and so on. Okay, but yeah, so a bunch of interesting issues there, thanks. Next question was also about the bias blind spot. And this is what's going on in the case of kind of these false negatives, right? Where people end up concluding. So we're now thinking about, it sounds kind of spotting me that I can maybe explain how people we get to the conclusion, maybe even rationally, that other people are biased or people who disagree with us in certain ways are biased. Why are we making this mistake, these kind of bad false negatives where, I end up concluding I'm not biased? And the general form of this worry is there's no epistemically respectable way to get there, right? And so why are people making this obvious mistake? So of course, one thing, what we're trying to explain is something psychological, right? And it might be that this is a mistake that wouldn't be made if people were impeccably rational. We still might have good reasons to think people are prone to make this mistake, but it shouldn't be some kind of ad hoc appeal to irrationality or something like that. But in this case, so again, the worry is this looks like a really bad mistake, is arriving at views about whether you're biased about politics, say, or something like that, being influenced about those judgments by thinking about your first order political beliefs and how well you're doing or something like that, right? Looks terrible. I think one thing that's quite plausible is even these cases where the epistemologist is inclined to give the advice, really, if you're doing the normatively appropriate thing, you bracket your first order judgment and consider this higher order issue without being influenced at all. I think it's pretty clear people aren't good at doing that, right? Or at least very plausible people aren't good at doing that. Just to motivate this a little bit, think about the disagreement literature where kind of similar issue comes up, where people like David Christensen and others, these independence principles. So if I find out that you and I disagree about some issue, some first order question, then I'm supposed to bracket what I actually think about the question and even my reasoning for that question, and just consider more abstractly with external evidence, well, how likely is Sinan likely to be right about this as opposed to me? I think David thinks that, and maybe that is the right normative story, but I think he's pretty quick to it. He's one of the first to admit that it isn't really what people are doing often. A theme of these early papers was we're too overconfident in these disagreement cases. If we were doing what we're supposed to be doing, we wouldn't be doing this. So I think this is just kind of this idea that, this bracketing thing that we're supposed to be doing and maybe ought to be doing. As a matter of fact, how plausible is it that people will do this and kind of forget, so to speak, temporarily about their political beliefs in arriving at these views, right? So that's one point to be made. Another point is you're still getting some asymmetry here, even on your preferred description of it, right? So you're getting this evidence or apparent evidence that the other people are biased, and you're not getting that with respect to yourself. So the kind of thing we're ultimately trying to explain is this asymmetry. You're still getting some kind of asymmetry. So use this example about height. It would be like, thinking that, I've got this evidence that all the people around me are short. and I don't have any evidence about my height, it'd be pretty easy to go from there thinking, I'm probably taller than the people around me, or it's likely I'm taller than the people around me, right? There's also this thing that we do, and some other theories about the bias blind spot presuppose this as well, that confusing an absence of evidence with evidence of absence, even when we shouldn't. So the kind of scenario you're imagining it, we don't have evidence whether we're biased or not. So it could be that kind of thing going on, is absence of evidence that we're biased gets turned into evidence that we're unbiased, which I agree, putting it that way seems fallacious. But there is this kind of even normative issue lurking, which is some people, and I don't want to fill this in with too many specifics, I'm gonna get too specific, but like there's lots of views in epistemology according to which you're kind of like entitled in some sense to think that. So let me back up a second, right? It's like you're thinking of the case as I should really be starting off neutral about whether I'm biased or not. And then just consulting my first order views doesn't seem like, and I agree with this, isn't giving me any evidence, right, about whether I am. So if I started off neutral or suspending judgment about the question, for all I know I'm biased, maybe I am. If I started off in that situation, and then I need getting more evidence, surely I should still be in the situation of, for all I know I'm biased, who knows, and so on. There's all kinds of views in epistemology which kind of suggest one way or the other that, no, you kind of have this kind of positive presumption and you're kind of entitled to entrust your own reasoning, and that you're not reasoning in a bad way, you're biased or something like that, until you actually get some positive reason to think that you are. And even though we were thinking about this case, you're not getting that kind of positive reason. So if you kind of started in this situation, kind of this optimistic view, you'd easily end up there by not getting any evidence which bears on it, right? So that's not, I think, a fully satisfying answer, but there's a few things I might say in response to this kind of concern. So let me stop there, and maybe I'll have a chance to swing back at some point and talk about knowledge or something like that. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Sinan. Thank you, Tom. Up next is Sophie.
All right, great. Yeah, so thanks to Luis and everyone for inviting me. It's really fun to see you guys. I wish it was in person, but it wouldn't happen if it was in person. So it's really cool to see you on the computer. And thanks to Tom for writing this book. I always really like reading your writing. It's so readable and so commonsensical. And then it always leads to like surprising places anyway. So that's always a lot of fun. And the things I'm going to focus on in my comments are two of the more surprising parts that I found in the book. So the first one is about symmetry and norms. Okay, so the first, let's see. So the main view that's explored and defended in this book is what Tom calls the norm theoretic account, which has been mentioned a bunch of times already. And according to this view, bias involves a systematic departure from a genuine norm. So at some points, Tom says this isn't supposed to be an analysis. It's not supposed to give necessary and sufficient conditions. Instead, it's supposed to be an explication. So it's an interesting view kind of in the neighborhood of our ordinary thought, which deserves special theoretical interest. So if it's just an explication, it's not really going to have counterexamples in the way that an analysis would. But in chapter 7, Tom talks about a couple things that look like counterexamples, or they would be counterexamples if it was understood as an analysis. And I thought that part was really interesting. So one of those counterexamples, or purported or would-be counterexamples, is about mispronunciation. So the example there is that 2 of Tom's kids, when they were young, would mispronounce words in a systematic way. I was disappointed that we didn't get the example of what they were saying, because it would have been cute. So I'll tell you about what one of my kids did, which was pronounce any kind of CH or G sound as blah. And so he would call chips plips, and he would call grapes blapes, and he called our friend James blame. And it was like really systematic and really predictable, but it was not a bias. So that was a systematic departure from a norm that was not a bias. So it's not captured by, or it is captured maybe erroneously by the norm theoretic account. Okay, the second example I don't have any personal experience with, thankfully, is about a serial killer. So that is Tom describes a serial killer who is morally scrupulous in every respect. He's polite, he never steals, he always tips his waiters, except for when it comes to his serial killing. And there he's just very systematically departing from a norm, don't kill people. Okay, so that looks like it would also count as a bias according to the norm theoretic account, but it would be weird to call this person biased, especially since they're so like even-handed in their ordinary life and so morally upstanding aside from this. Okay, so this looks like an objection. These are cases where the account is looking like it's going to categorize them with biases, but they're not biases. And in response to that objection, Tom considers two replies. So he says, first, we might just give up the norm theoretic account and just take these to be counterexamples. The second one is a little more interesting. So the second suggestion is that we maintain that these are examples of bias, but then we have this explanation for why we're not likely to call them bias. So Tom says, maybe we're just more likely to apply the term bias to some systematic departures from norms than to others. And then right after that in this chapter, there's some discussion that supports the second reply about symmetry. And so Tom argues that often bias involves a violation of symmetry. And we could sort of add that to this response to the serial killer and the mispronunciation examples by pointing out that these examples don't involve symmetry, and then saying, okay, well, that's why we're not likely to call them bias, even though on this explication, they really are. Okay, so I was convinced by a lot of this picture, but I found myself wondering why Tom was going in this direction rather than flipping it the other way around. So why not go for an account that holds that symmetry is the thing that's essential to bias, and that norm violation is the sort of secondary thing that explains our practices of attribution? So we could call that the symmetry theoretic account of bias. And on this view, bias is a systematic departure from a symmetry, maybe some contextually salient symmetry. And then whether or not the symmetry corresponds to a genuine norm is what explains why we do or don't call it a bias. Okay, so one thing I wonder about is exactly how different this is from the view that Tom ultimately defends. So at the end of chapter 7, he says a bunch of stuff that sounds a lot like what I'm calling the symmetry theoretic view. So he says, okay, the norm in question doesn't have to be genuine. It merely has to be a contextually salient standard. And that standard should be naturally thought of in terms of symmetry. And then I also, my close reading skills detected that this part of the chapter, he starts using the word standard a whole bunch rather than norm. And so maybe that suggests kind of moving away from the norm idea as central. And then he also writes that when we attribute bias, we can choose whether or not we're using the attribution in a pejorative way. And when we use it pejoratively, we're implying that the standard is a norm. And when we use it non-pejoratively, we're not committed to that, or maybe we're implying that it's not a norm. Okay, so maybe Tom already agrees with a lot of what I'm suggesting. And so maybe he would be open to the idea that symmetry is central and that norm violation is more secondary, but they're both important. But I think there is a substantive question about which of these features plays which role and which one should be the more central one. And given that the book does defend the norm violation as the central feature of bias, it's also worth looking at what might change if we went the other direction. Okay, so here's a couple of potential virtues of the symmetry theoretic view. So first, it looks like it correctly categorizes those counterexamples. The mispronunciation case, the serial killer case, those are cases of bias, or sorry, they're not cases of bias because they're not cases of asymmetry, according to this view. And it also captures some other cases. So a person who systematically deviates from the rules of logic or math. There's also ass number 4. That's the ass that always goes for the bale of hay on the right. Seems like it gets the right answer about him too. Okay, second, it seems like it gives a good explanation for why there are so many non-pejorative uses of the word bias. So if symmetry is the central thing, then we'd expect to find lots of uses that are pejorative when the symmetry corresponds to a norm, and also lots of cases where it's not pejorative because there's some contextually salient symmetry, but it's fine to depart from it. We'd expect to see people applying the concept in those cases. And then third, I would think that if symmetry were not essential to bias, we would expect to find some cases of bias that were not also violations of symmetry, but I can't think of any. And looking at all of Tom's examples in the book, they do seem to me like they're all examples of symmetry violation. So unless there's some cases that I just haven't thought of, it does seem like insofar as we're inclined to call something bias, we're also inclined to think of it as a violation of symmetry or a violation of some standard of treating like cases alike. Okay, so here's a challenge for the symmetry theoretic view. One might argue it would have a harder time explaining why most cases of bias, including the most paradigmatic cases, do also involve departure from a norm. So if norms are just the secondary thing, why are they playing such an important role? And here's a hypothesis in response to that worry on behalf of the symmetry theoretic view. Maybe it's often the case that when some given symmetry is contextually salient, that's because it's also normatively relevant. So a lot of the norms that govern us do require us to treat relevantly like cases alike. A lot of times they are norms of symmetry or fairness or things like that. And so maybe when we call attention to the violation of some contextually relevant symmetry, a lot of times the reason that we're doing that is because we want to call attention to the violation of a norm. So that's why we're bringing it up. That's why it's like interesting to talk about. On the other hand, sometimes there's a symmetry that's contextually salient because we would be inclined to think that it's normatively relevant, but maybe it's not. So maybe this is the kind of situation we're in when we try to call attention to something by calling it a good bias or beneficial bias or something like that. So this is maybe what the cognitive scientists are doing. Okay, so that's the symmetry view. I'm curious to hear what Tom thinks about it. Apparently Brian is going to raise a very similar issue. But yeah, I would like to know what you think, if how it's different from the norm theoretic view. Insofar as it is different, why should we go for the norm theoretic view instead? Okay, that was my first comment. My second comment is going in the opposite direction. So this one is taking on board the norm theoretic view and then giving some suggestions about further work that it could do, specifically because of its reliance on norms. So I'm going to switch gears. So forget that I said I don't like the norm theoretic view, and now I love it. Okay, so yes, so this second comment regards the bias blind spot and the fact that we generally have a hard time telling when we're biased. Okay, so as we just talked about a bunch, Kelly's story about this is that from the point of view of your own beliefs, it's just inevitable that you're going to regard incompatible beliefs as incorrect. And so given that you're figuring out who's biased and who's not from your own perspective, you're going to say that people who systematically disagree with you are systematically incorrect and therefore biased. And so this can explain a lot of the bias blind spot in a kind of structural way. But I wanted to raise the possibility of a different kind of explanation, which doesn't conflict with the one that Tom gives, but it would be an extra thing that it seems like he could say, but I didn't find him saying it in the book. So that is, it seems like if you are thinking of yourself as biased and you think of bias as departure from a norm, then self-attribution of bias would involve a problematic kind of acrasia. So if you think of yourself as departing from a norm of rationality or prudence or morality or whatever, then calling yourself biased means calling yourself irrational, immoral, imprudent, etc. And moreover, calling yourself biased as opposed to simply irrational means that there's some direction in which your errors are tending to go. So they have to be systematic in the way that Tom describes. And it seems like that's a worse position to be in, a worse kind of acrasia, when you say, like, I'm systematically departing from this norm in this certain direction. That's worse than just saying, I'm departing from the norm. Seems like there should be some kind of pressure to then align your beliefs or your actions with your normative judgments. Either there's rational pressure or there's just psychological pressure to avoid cognitive dissonance. It seems like there would be an especially uncomfortable, it would be especially uncomfortable to be in that state where you think of yourself as departing systematically in a certain way, but you're also not doing anything about it. So take a case of epistemic acrasia. So maybe you think your child is more talented at baseball than the others on the kids' team. But then you also regard yourself as interpreting the evidence in a biased way that's skewed towards your own child. So when your child misses the ball, it's because the sun was in their eyes. But when another kid misses a ball, it's because he got distracted. Maybe you realize that you're interpreting the evidence in this partial way. So regardless of whether there's some kind of fancy level connecting norm, it does seem like it would be at least psychologically easier to align your beliefs, either by kind of rationalizing away this bias attribution and thinking like, well, actually, the sun was in their eyes, or else by going the other direction and just coming to terms with the fact that your kid is just as good at baseball as her friends. Okay, so I'm conjecturing that maybe this could help explain the bias blind spot. Of course, I don't have any empirical backup for any of this. So luckily, I'm just giving comments and I don't have to provide any evidence. And I haven't looked into it, but it does seem like that's a possibility. If bias is departure from a norm, there should be some kind of important connection between acrasia and self-attribution of bias. And potentially this is some more work that the norm theoretic account could do. And I'm curious what Tom thinks about that.
Great.
That's comments.
Great, thank you. So let me start with the second bit, since I just finished talking about that. You asked me you make this proposal, here's an account, you could explain the bias blind spot this way, and asked me, what do you think about it? Short answer, I love it. In fact, I'm pretty confident I love it more than you do, right? Because you're kind of saying, well, if I was into this thing about norms and the bias, I'm into that. And so I love the proposal. I know you're just kind of trying it on for size or something, conditional on this other stuff. I think it's deeply right. And it's very much in line with the way I'm thinking about things. You're right, when I actually went back and looked, reading your comments about the bias blind spot discussion, I should have been much more explicit, I should have said more of this. It's really the previous chapter where I kind of I want to explain, in that chapter, I want to explain the bias blind spot in terms of the perspectival account of bias attributions. It's really in the previous chapter when I introduce and explain the perspectival account of bias attributions, where you get the idea that really the rational, to the extent this has a rational aspect, it's a kind of coherence. That's where the rest of keeping in line your views at different levels, your views about bias and your first order views. And so I think the key insight that I take both of us to be onto is something like this. Once you start thinking about the connections among levels, both the psychological connections and the rational connections, where again, the levels are first order beliefs about the topic. In your example, your beliefs about how good your child is at sports. And on the other hand, your higher order views about who's biased about the topic and who's unbiased and the extent to which they're biased. And among the people who are biased, what direction they're missing and so on. Once you start thinking through the level connections, you see that certain combinations just don't go well together. There's a kind of incoherence, and therefore they're psychologically and rationally unstable. And one of these bad combinations is when you're talking about here, holding a bunch of beliefs about a topic while simultaneously I hold a bunch of beliefs about a topic and I simultaneously believe I'm a biased believer about that topic, because what it is to be a biased believer about a given topic is to be the kind of believer who misses in a certain direction, right? So that idea that certain combinations are kind of rationally off limits or close to rationally off limits, that gets discussed in the previous chapter. And there I give this example. When I introduce I give this example. Suppose, Sophie, you and I are talking about politics, and suppose that we usually agree on issues. But on those occasions when we disagree, your opinion tends to be to the left of mine, right? And again, we're using some kind of natural metric here, to the left of, to the right of. And so one thing I might do, just to be clear how it's kind of a coherence thing, one thing, I don't mean to be presupposing any of you about disagreement or sticking to one's guns here, one thing I might do in responding to find that you disagree with me about this certain question is just conciliate and give up my belief, maybe believe what you believe or suspend judgment or something like that. If I'm doing that, there's no pressure, no rational pressure on me to think of you as biased, right? But if I stick to my guns and say, no, I know Sophie thinks this, but she's wrong, here's how it is, then the more this happens, the more rational pressure there is on me to conclude that Sophie has a left-wing bias when it comes to politics. Because from my point of view, she tends to miss to the left when she misses. And one thing that's supposed to be interesting about that in the book is I get that pressure even if I have no idea what Sophie's evidence is or how she reasoned to get where she is. The mere fact that we're disagreeing in this way, in a systematic way, puts rational pressure on me if I'm sticking to my guns to conclude that you're biased, right? So idea there, and that's one of my paradigms, there's something rationally and therefore psychologically, to the extent you're rational. Now, I don't want to cheat because in response to Sinan, I was kind of saying, well, we shouldn't expect people to be rational. And that's how I can explain this. Here, I kind of am thinking, or at least in the, but I think this is kind of a plausible combination, at least in these kind of coherence type things where, yeah, I'm thinking that you're perfectly unbiased, but then I think you always miss to the left. There, I really do think that's a bad enough conflict that not only is there rational pressure, but there's some psychological pressure, right? So that's kind of my example to illustrate the perspectival thing, this interpersonal case, an example of a bad combination that puts both psychological and rational pressure on you. Similarly, what the real non-hypothetical Sophie points out in her comment is that the following is just a bad place to be, a bad combination to be in, having all these beliefs about a subject matter while thinking that you yourself are biased about that subject matter, precisely because what it is to be a biased believer is to be the kind of believer who misses in a certain direction, right? So it's no accident that in non-pathological cases, we don't end up concluding that we're biased. You mentioned just a little footnote about this. You said you're lucky, you don't have any empirical evidence to suggest this is what's going on. So you're lucky that you're a commentator or critic rather than the author, who presumably might be expected to produce some kind of empirical evidence, if you're arguing from some theory. The way I finesse this in the book when I'm talking about the bias blind spot is, I kind of think that there's certain facts that I can account for better and so on, but also I do agree it's an empirical question. What's the actual psychological, what's going on in people's heads when this is happening? But I do have this kind of fallback thought that if you have the true view, according to me, about bias and about bias attributions, you'll see that the bias blind spot is inevitable. And the claim I make, or it's exactly the thing we would have gotten, the claim I make is, even if none of the psychological mechanisms that the psychologists are positing were operative, you'd still kind of get this effect. This is my claim anyway. So that's kind of finesse the fact that I'm not doing my own experiments or anything like that, trying to vindicate my hypothesis. Okay. Now, Sophie's first question is about why not go for a symmetry theoretic account of bias? And there's actually two big questions here. One is how different would a symmetry theoretic account be from my norm theoretic account? And then the question is, to the extent they are different, why not prefer the symmetry theoretic account? Are there reasons for norm theoretic? Brian is going to raise very much this same type of issue, but say some additional things. So I know this is a non-standard kind of Jerusalem or something. I'm thinking maybe I could save a little bit of my Sophie time and let Brian speak and then address both Sophie and Brian on the symmetry theoretic option that's out there in space, if that's okay.
Sounds good. So you're up, Brian.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here, and I just wanted to pile on to what Sinan and Sophie said about the merits of the book. So I'll just say a couple things. Firstly, I think it's a real page turner, which is kind of all too rare in philosophy. So I think this is about a lot of Tom's work, but I was lucky enough to read the book in draft and tore through it in just a few days or a bit under a week, which is fast for me. Maybe some of you are faster readers than me, but that's really tearing through it by my standards. And the other thing is just that I think it's one of these books that really winds up influencing how you think going forward. So it's a book where the central ideas kind of stay with you and you find yourself returning to them. And it's not the sort of thing where you just read it, put it back on your shelf, and kind of forget about it. Okay, so my comments are going to target the norm theoretic account. And they're going to raise the possibility, like Sophie did, of going symmetry theoretic as well, which used to be the kind of way I was thinking we ought to go, that we just ought to really foreground symmetries, background norms a little bit, go fully symmetry theoretic. But I've become increasingly worried about whether that kind of fully gets things right either. So I'm going to close with just confusion and a request for Tom to come in and sort things out. Okay, so just to reiterate, the norm theoretic account of bias says that a bias involves a systematic departure from a norm or standard of correctness. And Tom uses the norm theoretic account to do a lot of work in the book. Centrally, it helps explain or vindicate the perspectival character of bias attributions, whereby when, you know, if your political views are systematically to the right of mine, I will be committed to seeing your views as biased, but you will likewise be committed to seeing mine as biased. And it also helps him explain the bias blind spot, which Sinan and Sophie have also talked about today. Okay, so there's a lot to like about the norm theoretic account, but I think that there are some really central cases of bias that, and central cases of things other than bias that put some pressure on the norm theoretic account. So firstly, it looks like there are some paradigmatic biases that don't look like systematic departures from norms or standards of correctness. So they don't fit nicely with the norm theoretic account. So the first case is just biased coins. So if a coin is biased, so it has a higher chance of landing heads than tails, it's biased, but it's not systematically departing from some norm because there's no norm, no genuine norm. Maybe there's a statistical norm, but there's no genuine norm saying that coins ought to have equal chances of landing heads and of landing tails. Or think of inductive biases. So you see a bunch of emeralds, which are green and therefore also grew, but you favor the hypothesis that all emeralds are green over the hypothesis that all emeralds are grew. But arguably, there's no norm that says that you ought to treat these two competing hypotheses equally. And so it's a bias, but you're not deviating from some norm. And then arguably bias towards the future would be like this. So suppose you prefer that your pleasures be in the future and your pains in the past, even at the cost of an overall worse lifetime pleasure to pain ratio. Here, you're biased, but arguably there's no genuine norm that you violate, a norm saying that your preferences ought to treat the past and the future equally. And then there are some systematic departures from norms that don't look like biases, and Tom gives these examples in page 149. I won't mention or go over the systematic mispronunciation case or the unbiased serial killer case because Sophie already mentioned those. Another one that Tom mentions is systematic mistakes in long division. So if you just kind of consistently make the same mistake in this kind of math problem, you systematically depart from a genuine norm, but you don't thereby count as biased. And I think we can actually add another case which involves the norm of truth that is Tom's focus on throughout much of the book. So the case of bias where you're violating the truth norm is the one where you kind of consistently overshoot or you consistently undershoot or you're consistently too far to the right or consistently too far to the left. But we can get another kind of systematic deviation from this norm of truth that doesn't seem like it counts as a bias. So suppose you're reliable with respect to most domains of facts, but there's some domain of facts with respect to which you're anti-reliable. So you just consistently get things wrong about, say, the weather. You're anti-reliable with respect to the weather. So if you say it's gonna rain, other people should conclude, oh, it's probably not gonna rain. Okay, so there you're systematically deviating from the norm of truth, but the systematicity involves the domain with respect to which you tend to violate it. And so I think that's a case where it wouldn't be natural to describe you as biased here. Okay, so all these examples suggest to me that we should emphasize symmetry. And obviously this isn't my own novel observation. Tom talked about it. He has a chapter on symmetry. He talked about it in his opening remarks. And Sophie also advanced a kind of symmetry theoretic account. So let's say this, the symmetry theoretic account as at a first pass says that a bias is a departure from a salient symmetry. So the question is, should we go norm theoretic or symmetry theoretic? I think Tom still thinks that we should go norm theoretic, but he wants to give a big role to symmetries. And as I read him, what he wants to say is that the norm theoretic account is an account of bias in the pejorative sense. So it's not an account of bias simpliciter, but just of that kind of subclass of biases, which are objectionable or negatively valenced. And then he adds that, quote, when a person is disposed to systematically depart from a standard or norm, the more their departures are naturally understood as deviations from symmetry, the more natural it will be to count the disposition as a bias. But I wonder whether we shouldn't, this account still foregrounds norms and sort of backgrounds symmetry. And I wonder why we shouldn't instead give a kind of full-throated symmetry theoretic account and say a bias simpliciter involves a departure from a symmetry, and a bias in the pejorative sense involves a departure from a norm which demands a symmetry. And that would make good sense of a lot of biases which do involve violations of norms which themselves demand symmetries. So they involve deviations from norms that demand symmetric treatment of people, regardless of whether they're your children or others' children, or regardless of whether they're black or white, etc. Or time biases which involve violations of a norm requiring that you treat certain times symmetrically, or status quo bias. And there are a lot of great examples in the book. And obviously it accounts really nicely for things like biased coins, right? The paradigm case of bias there. Okay, so first question in going forward, I want to sort of first talk a little bit about how going symmetry theoretic might complicate some of the main proposals in the book. And then I want to raise a couple of problems for a symmetry theoretic account. Okay, so 3 cases where going symmetry theoretic in the way that I've sketched might at least complicate some of the interesting proposals in the book. So the first is that it might yield counterexamples to, and I should say this one's kind of just for fun. I don't know how seriously I take it, but so if we tie bias to asymmetry, it might yield counterexamples to Tom's thesis, persons never fundamental, which appears in the early chapters of the book. This is the thesis that whenever a person is biased, this is a derivative matter. It depends on the way in which they are related to some other thing or things that are biased, like maybe a belief-forming process or something like that. And the fact that the person is biased is grounded in more fundamental facts about these other biased things. Okay, so if we go symmetry theoretic, we might notice that people themselves have physical biases. So, some cases, I don't know if it's really the person who has the bias, but suppose I'm disposed to miss right rather than left when shooting free throws. Maybe that's a bias, and maybe it's a bias that's like fundamentally about me. Or really just for laughs, just make it parallel to the coin flip case. Suppose that, I'm weighted in such a way that when I do flips off the diving board, I tend to belly flop rather than back flop. Maybe I'm biased toward my belly in just the way that a sort of coin might be biased towards heads. Okay, like I said, I think that's just more or less just for fun. Second, I think it at least complicates the perspectival character of bias attributions, because even though it's a perspectival matter whether one seems to systematically depart from certain norms like the norm of truth or accuracy, I don't think it's generally going to be a perspectival matter whether one violates a salient symmetry. And last one, and very relatedly, I think it complicates Tom's explanation of the bias blind spot, because violations of symmetry should often be very easily introspectable, and I think it should often be easier to detect asymmetries in oneself than in others. So I think this holds for physical asymmetries, right? Yeah, you're very aware if you look in the mirror, if you play a sport, of your physical asymmetries, and probably more aware of those than the asymmetries of others. But also for these other, kind of pejorative biases like time bias, I think arguably it should be like very easy to introspect and detect your own time biases, whereas for others you have to kind of use behavioral evidence, which is kind of a little bit murky. Okay, so, and I know Tom has already said a little bit in response to Sinan about whether all biases kind of yield the bias blind spot or just some. So I think going symmetry theoretic kind of makes that issue more salient, perhaps. Okay, so I think there's a whole lot to be said for the symmetry theoretic account of bias over the norm theoretic account. So we say bias simpliciter is deviation from a symmetry. Bias in the pejorative sense is a departure from a norm, which is one that demands a symmetry. So a norm prescribing asymmetric treatment of times or differential treatment of people who are otherwise equally placed. Okay, but I think there are a couple of big problems. So first, what about biased beliefs where the relevant norm is that of truth or accuracy? This is the really central case in the book that kind of recurs throughout. Well, the norm of truth isn't a norm which demands a symmetry. So it's not like the norm that prescribes time bias, or the norm of temporal neutrality, which says you ought to treat these times symmetrically. The norm of truth and the norm of accuracy isn't a norm that demands any kind of symmetric treatment of anything. It doesn't say anything about treating different propositions equally. It just says that your beliefs ought to be true, and symmetry is kind of beside the point. What I think is going on here is that it's the systematic, in the case where you're, for example, overly conservative, overly progressive, it's the systematic nature of your departure from the norm of truth that yields an asymmetry. It's not that you violate a norm which is itself demanding a symmetry, but rather you deviate from some other norm, a norm not demanding any kind of symmetry, but the systematic nature of the departure in some cases amounts to an asymmetric departure from that norm. So, for example, because your beliefs, when you err, you disproportionately tend to err on the side of conservatism rather than progressivism, for example. Okay, so I think at a minimum, then we've got to complicate the symmetry theoretic account as I stated it, and also I think it raises a problem for what Tom said in his opening remarks, namely that we're often willing to attribute bias to an agent when they're disposed to systematically depart from a contextually salient symmetry standard, and that bias in the pejorative sense is a special case where the salient symmetry standard is a genuine norm, because again, there's no norm saying that your violations of the truth norm, if such there be, should be symmetrically distributed. Okay, so I think at a minimum, we've got to modify our account, say a symmetry theoretic account to say a bias simpliciter is a departure from a symmetry, and bias in the pejorative sense is either a departure from a symmetry which is demanded by some norm, or it's a disposition to depart from some other norm, but in an asymmetric way. I worry a little bit that account might be a bit disunified and disjunctive, but I want to just close with one other problem, which is that, and focus on the non-pejorative sense of bias, it seems to me that there are some departures from salient symmetries that aren't naturally described as biases, and especially when we look at physical asymmetries. So the coin being biased, that's a paradigm case of bias that's captured by the symmetry theoretic account. But suppose that my left leg is a bit longer than my right. I deviate from a very salient symmetry. Let's suppose it's a context where that's very salient, but I'm not thereby biased. Or suppose I draw a picture which is notably asymmetric in some way. I violate a salient symmetry, but my drawing isn't biased. Okay, maybe that's because it's not systematic, my deviation from the salient symmetry. But suppose I just do this a lot. I'm in the business of doing these drawings or creating objects which are notably asymmetric in a certain way. I systematically kind of deviate from a salient symmetry, but neither me nor the objects I am creating are thereby biased. So I'm not entirely convinced that we can capture all the cases by going symmetry theoretical either. I think there's clearly a tight connection between bias, norms, and symmetries. But I'll turn it over to Tom to see if he can sort out some of my confusion and say a bit more about how he sees the relation between bias, norms, and symmetries.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So finally, I'll stop talking about the bias blind spot and talk about symmetry. So a question that both Sophie and Brian ask, given everything I say about symmetry in the book and the plausibility that there is some connection, some important connection between symmetry and bias, why not just go for a symmetry theoretic account of bias as opposed to the norm theoretic account? And I'm sure when they discovered that the other one had come up with this idea, they thought, aha, this must be right, because independent convergence. I don't know if it helps or hurts me to report that there's even more independent convergence, because when I was thinking about this stuff years ago, I too had the idea of symmetry theoretic account, but then rightly or wrongly, upon much further reflection and so on, I talked myself out of it as not going this direction. Say something about that. So proposal on the table, it's at least, I think Sophie just suggested this and Brian floated it. Look, when you're trying to understand the most general notion of bias in the neighborhood, where it's not built in, there's something negative about it, we'll do that in terms of symmetry theoretic account, and maybe something, I forget exactly how Brian put it, but something's biased differently if it systematically departs from some salient symmetry standard. And then maybe we'll understand bias in the pejorative sense as a special case where the departures from symmetry involve departing from some genuine norm or something like that. So one question that Sophie asks is explicitly, maybe, is how different is that from the view I take in the book? And I think the answer is not that different, right? After all, the norm theoretic account really is, I should have been even more clear about this. Norm theoretic account really is an attempt to give an account of bias in the pejorative sense. And that's what I would say about some of these putative counterexamples. I'm not saying it's counterexample free or anything, but like Brian mentioned the case of inductive biases and biased coins. I'd say, yeah, that's something else. That's not really this negative notion. And I think the time biases case, which Brian mentioned, is an interesting case. I think that really kind of depends on these, as it should, on these substantive issues. What's the right thing to say about these biases? So I think not that different. If somebody wrote a book, or my past self decided to write the book, where first you start giving this general account of the most general notion of bias in the neighborhood in terms of symmetry, and then went on to talk about here's this very special case, or not very special case, but this important special case in terms of norms, I would regard that person as at least a fellow traveler, where a lot of the difference would be, kind of the way it's presented and the way it's marketed and so on. And maybe I could have made better decisions along that dimension. That having been said, there are some substantive issues here. One Sophie mentioned, but there's this first substantive issue, which is I don't actually accept a symmetry theoretic account of the most general notion of bias. So I don't think things, unfortunately, are as nice and clean as all that. So then there's this other question. So one question raised was, how different am I? Then there's, how good would the symmetry theoretic account be as an account of bias in general? Suppose you just endorse that as an analysis of bias. Would there be counterexamples? This is a question Sophie asks and Brian explores. And here, I agree. I mean, Sophie says, try to think of some. I didn't come up with any. Here, I agree with Brian. I think there are counterexamples, if you're thinking about that as an analysis. And one of the ones he mentions is, in fact, the one that really moved me away from it when I was thinking of in these terms, which is the example of truth, the norm of truth or accuracy, however we're understanding that. I don't think that, this is the point of convergence between Brian and me, I don't think that the norm of truth or accuracy is best thought of as a symmetry standard. But otherwise, I mean, so Sophie introduced this locution I think is helpful when she's talking about symmetry, which I also use in the book, which is symmetry involving treating like cases alike. And so I think that's helpful. So here's what I'm putting in point. I don't think that systematic departures from the truth or accuracy norm are best understood as failures to treat like cases alike. It's kind of tempting because it seems like something that's going on. But suppose, I mean, you can't get this isn't the right way to think about the truth norm. That's a really big deal for me because the truth norm is super central. People have pointed out that lots of applications in the book depends on the truth norm and so on. But even before we get to that stage, I really do think when we think about biased believers, we really do often want to think in terms of the truth norm, as opposed to, so nowadays, lots of people under the influence of Williamson think the primary norm for believers has to do with knowledge, right? I think if we're thinking about bias, that view doesn't look so good, that the primary norm has something to do with knowledge, precisely because, for example, there'll be all sorts of contexts where we kind of agree knowledge is off the table, but you can still make sense of the believer being biased, right? So suppose that we're making predictions, all of us are making predictions about what it's going to be like in 100 years, and okay, give me your best predictions, what's going to be going on. We all kind of agree, look, of course, nobody knows what it's going to be, what's going to be like 100 years from now. But still, from the God's eye point of view, God knows the truths about the future. He can still say, Brian has an optimistic bias because his predictions about the future are consistently too optimistic compared to what's going to happen. And Tom has a pessimism bias. His predictions are consistently too pessimistic. So I think there, no knowledge, but we want to understand bias in terms of some kind of truth or accuracy norm. Similarly, I like the idea that the weather forecasting model can be biased in virtue of being inaccurate, in virtue of being consistently too high with its predictions. And then the weather forecaster might be biased in the same way, being too high. We don't want to describe the weather forecasting bias in terms of knowledge. There you want to use accuracy. So I really think that's not just me, because I have these applications with the bias blind spot and so on involving the truth or accuracy norm. I really think when we're thinking about norms in the context of bias, the truth or accuracy norm is an absolutely central case. And if we can't understand that, the truth norm, as a symmetry standard, that would be a real reason not to say the most general notion is going to be captured in terms of symmetry, given the centrality of that case. I'm open, as you might imagine, given what I reported about my past thinking about these topics. I put quite a bit of, put some work into different ways of thinking about the truth norm as a kind of symmetry standard. And people smarter than I am put some work into this. When I was doing these ideas in a graduate seminar at Princeton, she's a graduate student, and then Snow Zhang, who's professor at Berkeley now, for doing a burst off. She was like, oh, of course we can do this, and various suggestions about how to understand the truth norm in terms of symmetry. I wasn't ultimately persuaded, but maybe I should have been, or maybe there's some other way to do it. So I'm very open to this idea of, symmetry we look so close with symmetry, but what about these accuracy norms, or the accuracy norm? I do want to caution us here, both, for that project, but also about, assuming that, there's some really tight, intimate connection between bias and symmetry, such that, of course, we're going to understand bias in terms of symmetry ultimately. There's this thing that might lead us to kind of overestimate symmetry in this kind of context, I think. And I say this as someone who thinks, no, there really are important connections between symmetry and bias attributions, which is, look, go back to this locution Sophie introduced, treating symmetry as a matter of respecting symmetries as a matter of treating like cases alike, right? Which I think is a helpful gloss. If you look at the law literature, the legal scholarship, there's this whole literature that goes back decades, talking about the norm, treat like cases alike, which, as you can imagine, in a legal context, that looks like a pretty good norm. It'd be unjust not to treat like cases alike in legal context and so on. And a big question that always comes up is, look, isn't this norm vacuous, right? Because every case will be like every other case in some respects and different in others. So you've really got to say, what are the relevant respects of likeness, right? And then there's this worry, but then isn't that going to be doing all the work? And how much work is the treat like cases alike norm going to be doing, and so on? And no doubt one can kind of overstate this worry, but there is this fact about symmetry, if we think of it in this way, respecting likeness or something, that it's so flexible, right? That, almost any mistake can be, if you work hard, can be massaged into a failure to treat like cases alike or something like that, right? So I just wanted to caution us about that kind of thing, because I kind of felt myself doing that. It's like, here and so on. And now I want to try to, maybe I'll end on this note. How much time do I have left on this? I lost track a little bit of the accounting here.
1 minute, Tom.
Oh, geez. Okay. So let me end by attempting to dramatically bring this point back to the very first thing that came up. Sinan and student Ron Abney, the point about gruesome metrics and so on, and realism versus non-realism about bias. And Brian, at one point in his comments, said, look, maybe it was some kind of, I don't use the word mistake, but Tom foregrounds the norm theoretic stuff. And kind of, it's not until, chapter 7 that I really start talking about, symmetry and so on. And gee, why did I do it that way? and other people ask me this too, start with the general stuff about symmetry and then move to the kind of pejorative stuff where I'm going to use norms to get at it. One thing that might have been going on in the background, I wasn't very explicit about this, is the following thought, is I started by saying, look, for at least some biases, I find myself inclined to be a realist about them, right? But those for me tend to go with, we've got genuine norms, right? Some kind of moral norms or genuine norms of rationality. Suppose we move to the more general notion, right? The one we're kind of tempted to understand in terms of symmetry or something like that. I think there's, or the non-pejorative uses, right? I think I'm much more tempted to go, in some sense, non-realist about a lot of those, right? So go back to the original paradigm where it's like we're responding to symmetry and lack of symmetry, the biased coin as a paradigm example of a biased object, right? So what is it to be a biased coin or an unbiased coin? Well, the unbiased coin exhibits a certain kind of symmetry. When it's flipped in a fair way, it's disposed to land heads 50% of the time, right? But of course, take something, the paradigmatic unbiased coin, there's lots of possible ways of flipping it where it wouldn't be disposed, given it's flipped that way, it wouldn't be disposed to land heads 50% of the time. Is there something privileged about this way of flipping it or something like that? There it seems to me not so plausible, right? So maybe even though there are all these facts about, well, if it's flipped in this way, it would land heads this percentage of the time and so on, describing it as biased, when we describe the biased coin as biased, well, it's disposed to land heads more than tails when flipped in a certain way. That really might not be carving reality at the joints, given that there's all these possible ways of flipping it where, go this other thing and so on. So that's just a speculative thought that just kind of occurred to me right now. And maybe one reason I was kind of foregrounding the case I was is I kind of think of that in realist terms in a way I'm less inclined to think of some of these other things in realist terms, precisely because of the flexibility of the symmetry notion in part. Okay, let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Sinan. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion and stay tuned in for the next episodes of The Philosopher Meets Critics.